I want to welcome everybody to the PCC program, the PCC forum. It's a little weird now since we are, I think, going to be exclusively doing this through Zoom for the foreseeable future. But I am very glad you are all with us today. Title of tonight's PCC forum is Indigenous Storytelling in Film as a new form of subtle activism. And this is co-hosted with Deep Water Initiative. Unfortunately, due to some sicknesses, we are going to have a smaller panel tonight than we were anticipating, but it should be a great show anyway. What we're going to be talking about here is a film panel that will explore different ways in which Indigenous communities and artists are working together to represent Indigenous cosmologies and storytelling through the medium of film. The panel will explore how film as a form of subtle activism advocates the rights, preservation, and regeneration of Indigenous lifeways on ancestral lands. We have Paige here with us tonight. Paige is the director of the Global Museum at San Francisco State University, where she also teaches courses in museum studies. She recently worked with graduate students to curate an exhibition on the impacts of climate change on Indigenous communities. Formerly an Associate Curator at the Autry Museum of the American West and lead curator of the California Continued exhibit. She's also held positions at the Natural History Museum of Los Angeles County and the California Academy of Sciences. She served as consulting producer and co-producer for multiple KCET projects, including Tending Nature, Tending the Wild, and the Art of Basketry episode on Artbound. So before we give it over to Paige, I'm going to introduce Chantal. Chantal, ESR Program Director, is that right?
Oh, well, and Program Director, ESR PhD student.
Perfect, yeah. And Chantal was kind enough to be our first presenter of 2020 and highly recommend her presentation as well, which is on our website, pccforum.wordpress.com. Check it out, where this new video will be posted soon enough. So Chantal, take it away.
Great. So thank you all for those who are joining us this evening. As some of you and most of you may know, this was meant to be an event of filmmakers from around the Bay Area who are working with Indigenous communities or who are from Indigenous communities and who are using film as their primary medium in order to institute or activate subtle forms of activism in order to create a larger awareness in times like these of the importance of Indigenous lifeways, traditional ecological knowledge, as well as Indigenous ways of being. Unfortunately, you know, all the events that were to be hosted at CIS were cancelled recently, and so we put up this online panel, which was due to be represented by 3 parties. 2 of the parties are now unable to attend due to the current situation, but we're really blessed and lucky to have Paige still present with us this evening. And the event was due to be hosted with PCC Forum, with the Ecology, Spirituality and Religion Department, as well as with a nonprofit organization that myself and my husband, Charlie Forbes, represent, called the Deep Water Initiative, which aims to educate people in the field of religion and ecology through film. Religion is meant to be defined as a broader category than what we understand by the large 5 religions represented in the world, as various states of spirituality and states of being that people use to represent themselves through forms of ritual, through forms of religious practice, And so Indigenous knowledges and Indigenous ways of beings forms a part of this. And so Paige Bardolph, which Matt introduced to us, is going to represent a project that was produced and presented on KCET last year. It's still on KCET currently, called Tending the Wild and Tending Nature, which aims to forecast Indigenous ways of engaging with nature within California and within the Bay Area. And this was a project that was commissioned and that came about, the collaboration between an independent TV channel as well as a set of museums. And Paige is actually not a representative from the producers or the TV channel, but a representative from the side of the museums. And what she's going to talk a little bit about as well is how film is, and the visual form of visual oral literature is an important part in preserving oral history and preserving oral story. So before Paige shares with us, what I'm going to do is I'm going to share 2 5.5-minute clips from the project. And I'll start with what Paige calls the more traditional clip, and then we'll come to the more contemporary clip from actually Aloni Cafe, which was due to do the catering for the event that was going to happen tomorrow at the Religion and Ecology Summit. And once we've gone through these clips, then Paige will give us a little bit of background into how she became involved in this type of work in a museum setting, and then how she became involved in the project overall. And then you can move forward to questions. So I'm going to share my screen here, and just let me know if you don't see what you need to see. And of course, let me know if you don't hear what you need to hear.
The beach every summer. And when I was a kid, there was so much fish, it was just abundant. We could have easily 14 rows of fish. Now, we haven't had a run here in 3 years. We worry about how are we going to teach our young ones if there's no fish to catch? If there's no mussels, no clams? How can you acquire a taste for something that doesn't exist? Our relationship with the sea is ancient. We have a lot of respect for her. We're thankful for what she provides to us. Carried through all of that is whatever we kill is for food. So we understand that we're not to take any life without using it correctly. The ocean is sick, and we as man have made her sick. But she's the one that feeds us every single day. And yet we're toxifying her, we're hurting her. And so we're spending time doing the science, trying to find out what is going on with the resources of the sea. Why are they disappearing?
So in the marine protected area, we selected species that were both cultural keystone species, meaning, you take them out of the culture and they'll sort of have this ripple effect, and also ecological keystone species. So similarly, where they're, important to sort of identifying the health of that ecosystem. So we focused on mussels, smelt, and seaweed.
Wow, how interesting. An MPA, or marine protected area, is an area that is designated by the state to have certain restrictions, certain take of particular species or no take at all, in an effort to conserve the area and provide a safe haven for species to go away from fishing pressures. All up and down the North Coast, there were a variety of different projects that hit on all different habitats that are going to be included in MPAs.
When the state decided to put these MPAs in our area, the tribe stood up and says, we're going to continue our traditional practices of harvesting these resources.
It was pretty clear in the law that there wasn't really acknowledgement of tribal rights in the marine protected areas. There was a need to sort of make that case to the state that tribes, retain these unceded rights to continue to use the ocean. We were successful in getting tribal take recognized in the state process. So it's been, a small victory in at least creating a space within the state framework. So then that rolled into the MPA baseline monitoring program.
I came on board to conduct the MPA baseline monitoring projects, which were a collaboration between tribes and academic institutions to establish a baseline of data of species that are present, population abundance, and that sort of thing.
We could try that.
So besides our biotoxin monitoring for mussels, razor clams, and plankton, we also do our smelt habitat assessments.
So this is a GPSing unit. So what we're going to do is we'll walk the perimeter of this gravel bed. And this gravel bed here is what we would consider smelt habitat.
All right, well, should we try to go get some more mussels then? So it's important to have a tribal perspective when coming into these projects because Indigenous people of the North Coast have been here since time immemorial. They've seen the changes, they know what's there. To have their perspective and their traditional knowledge in these projects is a key piece to understanding the current resources and the current uses of these resources.
Indigenous peoples have been using these areas forever, and there is some level of management going on between people and environment. And so I think we're sort of far removed from understanding that intrinsic connection and sort of interrelationship.
You have the traditional side on how to take care of resources, and then you have the actual numbers or data that we collect, and it shows that change. So it all works together. In the sense, in Western science, it's just backing up what we've been taught, correct?
Right, I'm just going to go to the second film here.
Public here. Every other culture is represented in their cuisine here in the Bay Area. It's important that Ohlone foods are also in that space. By having Ohlone foods here today, it makes it inarguable that we are here.
There's a contemporary phrase that we have, which is Makwarap hashe irek, makwarap isha aye. Ground turned to stone, but the world is still alive. We're in the midst of all this urbanity. We got to make sense of our worlds. And it is urban. The ground is stone. And no matter what, you can never separate us from this place either. We're doing what we can, what we have available. So sometimes that means creating a cafe space in the back of a bookstore. Just so everybody knows what our menu is today. To start off, we have a rosehip tea and an elderberry tea, a native green salad, and a dressing of walnut oil and blackberry juice. We have soft-boiled quail eggs, acorn soup, one of them with flour honey, one of them is left unsweetened, acorn flour brownies. We have venison that's currently being smoked with bay laurel and bay salt from San Francisco Bay shoreline. So, Akoit, welcome. Nesa makam. Now let's eat.
Cafe Ohlone by Artbound Museum is tucked away back patio here at University Press Bookstore. We're across the street from UC Berkeley, surrounded by all of this activity.
Louis and myself started Makamham, which in Chochenyo language it means our food.
It's an organization that we started in order to return our traditional Ohlone foods to our families who haven't experienced them in at least 2 generations.
This very place right here could be where our direct ancestors gathered 400 or 500 years ago. And when we're gathering these plants again, it just
getting back into that groove of how our people have always done it. This is a laurel. In our language, we call this Sokote. In Rumsen, Sokoch. So right here, this is the Charishmin in Chochenyo, Charishim in Rumsen, which is the Yoruboina. This is an herb that we make into a tea. It's that quintessential taste of home. When I started working at Mission Dolores, I really did the most that I could to talk about our strength, our survival, our perseverance, and our continuity as well. Eventually, it just reached a boiling point for me where I realized, my time here on Earth can be spent reversing what the mission has done to us. And instead of just talking about those things, this work that we're doing, it's like defying gravity because we're moving against what was supposed to happen. We live in this society right now that's always getting things in an instant, getting food in an instant, whatever we need. And in this like fast food, world that we're living in, slow foods is trying to buck that trend. And that means eating seasonally. People, I don't think, understand how decadent and how rich our diet is. We always say that our food is inherently bougie, because just the ingredients on their own. This is a blackberry yerba buena laurel dipping sauce. And we will add a little bit of acorn flour to this to thicken it. This is the bay laurel we gathered yesterday. These are quail eggs, atush Texan in our language. These are going to be soft boiled for 3 minutes. And we're going to have roasted venison backstrap that's wrapped in yerba buena. We're going to have Lewis's acorn flour brownies,
which is something that we made to introduce acorn to our young people. We adapted a brownie recipe to include acorn flour and to use coconut oil rather than butter.
For me, I think that our contemporary foods that we're making are foods that our people would recognize because they're rooted in everything that's traditional. We don't cook with anything that wasn't here in those pre-contact days. There is always room for creativity, but we also know that there's rules that we have to follow too. With those rules, that means that we have to be steadfast and making sure that we don't change things too much, because otherwise that changes the nature of what our food is.
Okay, great. So now I'm gonna.
We just want this place to be an expression of our culture and show that to both our community people and also to the public, so that they know, how lasting.
I'm gonna give it over to Paige to share about these 2 videos.
Great. Well, hello everyone. Welcome and thank you for joining. Do I see Fran on there? I think so. I think I might see one of my colleagues on the video. So nice to meet you all, albeit virtually. And thank you for letting me speak to your group tonight. I want to start out by saying that this project that I've now been involved in for many years is a huge privilege to work with. I myself am not Native, but I have been working and collaborating with Indigenous communities sort of throughout my museum career. And to be able to work with KCET, which is a public media group based out in Southern California, to help serve as a facilitator for transmitting this type of knowledge has just been a really high point of my career as a museum professional, because documentary filmmaking is such an important part of storytelling, of documenting oral history, of showing continuity in culture. I'll talk a little bit more detail about the project, but one of the main reasons that it came about was that oftentimes in museums, Indigenous communities are portrayed in a very static manner. So to be able to have documentary footage like these clips that we just watched alongside traditional objects of material culture is really powerful, because it reminds our visitors that these communities are still here, thriving in California, actively participating in these traditions, but also living contemporary lives, just like all of us here. So I'll tell you a little bit about my background. I studied history at UC Berkeley, so right here in the Bay Area, and then obtained a master's degree in museum studies. I actually got my interest in museums as a senior in my undergraduate at UC Berkeley, doing a research apprenticeship project in the Museum of Vertebrate Zoology on the Berkeley campus, if anyone's familiar with that institution. And I was doing an archival history project about the founding of the museum and its origins, and looking at old field notes and thinking about ways that some of these collecting expeditions happened all the way back to the turn of the 20th century. So sort of sparked my interest in museums as a career, a way to think about history a little bit differently. And I ended up going on to graduate school, where I was fortunate to work with some very significant collections, including the California Indian Basketry collection at the Phoebe Hearst Museum of Anthropology. So fast forward a little bit, I was fortunate to then move down to Los Angeles and work in the curatorial department at the Autry Museum in Los Angeles. I don't know if anyone's familiar with that institution. For anyone that has been to the Autry in LA, in 2016, we opened a major project that was called California Continued, which I served as lead curator for, that focused all about Native California traditional ecological knowledge, but also how it helps inform contemporary environmental thinking. And that was really the birthplace of this KCET Tending the Wild and Tending Nature documentary series. The exhibition was actually funded by a grant called the Nature Education Facilities Program. It was a grant that the California State Park Service had several years ago, which funded projects across the state at museums, at botanical gardens, at nature centers, other interpretive centers. And all of these projects had to be public interpretive ways to showcase the California environment. We were able to put a unique spin on our grant because the narrative that we were presenting was from the indigenous knowledge of California. We had a huge Native California collection in the museum, but as I mentioned in the beginning, oftentimes they were interpreted solely in the past. And that's something that I really wanted to change during my time there. Ways to use objects, whether it's an Ohlone basket that was used to gather acorn, or a feather headdress that's worn in a ceremony, or a steatite bowl from Catalina Island that's ferried over on a plank canoe between the islands and the mainland down in Los Angeles. Rather than having these objects seem older and static and unchanged, we wanted to put them in conversation with contemporary environmental issues. So we ended up dividing the exhibition into 4 spaces that were themed around fire, salmon, desert, and plants. And each of those stories featured these objects, but also talked about what communities in different areas around California are doing, whether it's salmon restoration projects up in the Trinity Klamath with the Yurok, Hoopa, and Curate tribes, whether it was protecting sacred sites down in southeastern California, particularly from solar development, which is an interesting question in itself, because of course we want to find ways to move away from big oil, but when big solar panels are being erected on sacred sites and burial grounds, that also raises a lot of questions. So it's a really interesting exhibit. I do encourage you to check it out. It is still on view. I think they're getting ready to change out some sections now that it's been up for 4 years. But during the project's development phase, around 2015 or so, we realized that in order to truly tell this story properly, we needed to feature documentary footage of community members working in these places, living in these places, actively engaged in these issues. So that's where this partnership with KCET formed. KCET is a PBS affiliate. They are based down in Burbank, and they produce a variety of documentary programming for public educational purposes. And a lot of it has to do with California themes, both cultural and environmental. So this series is just one of many. They have some really great programs. I've also consulted for them on a few other episodes, including a series called Lost LA, which is all about sort of unknown histories of the Los Angeles area. We did an episode on the wildlife species that used to frequent the LA River before it was channelized, for example. There's another series called Artbound, which focuses on different artists and artistic traditions across California. We did an entire episode on California Indian basketry as one of those episodes. So I definitely recommend that you check out KCET's website. The two clips that Chantal kindly just streamed are just shorter clips of longer episodes. There are 3 seasons now with half-hour long episodes that dive even deeper, as well as short clips and editorial pieces. And the clips really cover the state of California, communities far and wide. I chose these 2 in particular because the first one with the Taloa Dine up on the north coast of California, it's a more remote area. They live a very traditional lifestyle. Some of the other episodes went all the way up to the Pitt River area in northeastern California, for example, or all the way out in the southeastern desert, close to Needles, California. But then others are right here in our cities, like the Cafe Aloni episode, which is filmed here in the San Francisco Bay Area. We have another episode that takes place in Los Angeles, which goes into more detail about the Tongva plank canoe tradition, the Tiat Society that I mentioned earlier. So it's a great series because it shows really the breadth of California's environmental diversity, but also how many Native people are here and all the diverse tribal traditions that are still really grounded in traditional ecological knowledge, but are also really contributing to how we think about the environment and environmental challenges that affect all of us as humans. So that's the main message behind the series is presenting traditional ecological knowledge, or TEK, as another legitimate source of knowledge alongside what we traditionally see as Western science and kind of these acknowledged ways of thinking about the environment. And that's something that's really important to me in the public messaging behind this series, is that it focuses on how we can use multiple lenses of inquiry, I guess would be a good way to put it, and multiple ways of thinking about the environment. And Western science is one, but Indigenous knowledge is another. Communities that have lived in their environments for generations, having really distinct relationships with plants, with water systems, with weather, what happens when these environments start to rapidly change. That's something that we also present in the current exhibition. I would say on view, but we're closed right now at San Francisco State University, is the impacts of climate change on Indigenous communities, because climate change and other environmental changes affect people disproportionately. Of course, it's something that we're all facing, but people do experience changes in their environments in different ways, especially if you live and you work and your relationships are very closely tied to it. So that's a little bit of an overview of how the project came into being. I originally met Vincent and Louis, the 2 founders of Cafe Aloni, while I was still at the Autry. And that was when Vincent was a curator at Mission Dolores, which is something that he mentions in the episode. And so we met through sort of fellow museum circles, but he ended up deciding to dedicate his life's work to Cafe Aloni and the revival of his Indigenous food traditions, for exactly what he states in that episode, is that we are still here, and being able to share that knowledge, and especially here in the Bay Area with such a thriving, vibrant food scene. It was amazing how successful they've been. So I hope that when you're able to host another event and all of this gets figured out one way or another, you're able to work with them again to do catering for an event in the future, because they're wonderful. But really all of this work has informed how museums and how public institutions can play a role in generating this type of thinking. Museums are institutions of informal learning. We have the really incredible opportunity to share with K through 12 school kids, to share with just drop-in visitors who are lifelong learners, to share with people coming in information that they're not getting in either public school or just in their daily lives. So that's why I think it's really important to think about the role of documentary film in exhibitions, because it's a way that visitors can experience this content that they might not be getting elsewhere. And it also helps bring museums a little bit more into the 21st century in terms of not just being kind of fixed static narratives. There's no way you can dispute that people aren't here. When you see their faces, you see this work. It's a really great way to engage visitors who, as we move into the 21st century, regardless, we need to start thinking about ways that people want to experience their spaces, and media plays such a big role in that. I mean, look at all of us here on Zoom tonight as we're shifting to online learning and distance learning, and I think that documentary film is only going to have a bigger impact on that in the future. The last thing I'll just mention too, which I said in the beginning, I'm not Native. I approach this from my museum background, my storytelling background. I'm a consulting producer, so what I do is I work with the KCET team of filmmakers, of script writers, of other executive producers to shape the ideas of these episodes, but all of the information comes from the community members themselves. We have a lot of initial conversations with them long before anything gets shot. We have phone calls, we go meet them in person, we ask what they want to share. And then once everything is shot, then I review all of the footage from sort of a technical perspective and just help make comments and notes and cleaning up little things. But the final version is also showed with the tribe or the participants of that episode, making sure that we're presenting accurately the story that they helped develop and script throughout the process. So it's a very collaborative documentary series, which is something I've also really appreciated about KCET and about that project. It's not so much us just going out there with a camera and people not knowing what to expect. The whole process is built on relationships, and it's just been a wonderful experience to be a part of. So.
Well, thank you, Paige, so much for sharing that story with us. I really, really appreciate this type of work. And one of the things, there's a few things I'd like to reflect on before opening up to questions to the rest of the audience, is that part of, and I have always been drawn to documentary filmmaking throughout various parts of my career. And one of the things that's drawn me to documentary filmmaking is that it gives a face to worlds that are not seen. And I think in contemporary life and in modernity and in the world of sort of proliferated social media and visual media, it's really hard to bring forward worlds from the margin that one doesn't easily see in one's daily life in any event. And so one of these ways that this was made very clear to me, where museums and documentaries came once again into play, is I grew up in South Africa during apartheid, and in the early 90s, the South African Nelson Mandela, well, this was already in the late 90s, Nelson Mandela and the chief rabbi at the time of the country collaborated to found the first Holocaust museum. And one of the things that they did was they made it mandatory for all schools within the Western Cape, where the museum was founded, to undertake a class in actually visiting the museum and watching documentaries about the museum. And it wasn't about them learning about the Holocaust, it was about them learning about racism. So being in a country that had experienced apartheid, they used this museum and this particular experience and the footage and the documentaries and the cultural references they had to teach the youth of that particular environment about racism. And I think something that always strikes me coming from South Africa, really struggling with how Indigenous stories are told within that particular context, coming to America, is that so much of Native American culture is just so unseen. You know, when you're in a country like South Africa, the dominant culture is actually, in some sense, post-apartheid, the native culture. But in America, a Native American culture is always the minority culture. So how do you bring that culture forward in a way that is not purely historical, but that also is really representative of the people that exist today and the struggles that they live with and sit with today? And so you brought this forward a little bit in showing how the museums tried to make these documentaries. But I'd like to ask you a little bit more about the personal engagements with the people that are in the documentaries, because to be a bit blunt, you know, being a foreigner coming to America, I've been here for 3 years, and I've barely found an opportunity to engage in contemporary cultural Native American and Indigenous environments. And so, you know, it's hard when I go to school, they're not represented there, or when I, you know, go to various cultural gatherings, they're not represented there. So what was the voice that they were trying to bring across, and how did you feel that they felt about themselves as Indigenous people, but at the same time being contemporary human beings, as we all are, trying to navigate the modern world in this time and period?
Sure. So I think the first thing I'll start with in that question is that a lot of things that I have heard from all of the communities I've worked with throughout both this project and other exhibitions that I have really co-curated with Indigenous community members. Even as a curator, I like to think of myself as a facilitator. We're starting to move away from that more outdated model of curating in museums in general. Not all museums, some are, you know, still very traditional, but I think more of the contemporary ones are starting to turn a decolonizing lens on their own institutions. And really any museum that is working with Indigenous material needs to have co-curators and advisory boards and ways to collaborate with community members. If they're not, I think they're in trouble. So that's always really defined my work. But one of the things that we really hear from a lot of the people that we work with, whether on exhibitions or on documentary projects, is the lack of land acknowledgement. And I think that's a big issue for Indigenous people across the United States, but particularly here in California. California has such tribal diversity and such a really amazing history, but it's something that, you know, stops in 4th grade with the sugar cube missions and Junipero Serra. And luckily, I think we're finally starting to readdress that history. I mean, it took until 2019 for Gavin Newsom to finally issue the formal apology. There are starting to be removals of racist monuments, or even kind of stripping names from some of these really distressing figures in our history that have always been celebrated. So I think we're sort of finally starting to reach that shift, but I think for a long time with no land acknowledgement in our spaces, and sort of inaccurate portrayals of history, the kind of biggest message that I got from all of the people that I've collaborated with is just that we are still here. whenever asking, what is the main takeaway you want visitors to walk away with when they either go through this exhibition or they watch one of these episodes. And sometimes I would expect, something more specific. Oh, I want visitors to learn about this very specific, aspect of our material culture tradition. And it's not that at all. It's really that takeaway of we are still here, that land acknowledgement, just acknowledging the Indigenous presence of the area. I love how Vincent talks about how in the beginning of that clip with Cafe Aloni that, the nature is still there, even if it's been kind of concretized and covered over. The land and the Indigenous presence is in every area that we live and we reside in. So I think just more acknowledgement of those spaces and more acknowledgement of the true history and not just the literal sugar-coated mission history version that unfortunately most of our kids get and stops at 4th grade and they don't really get since. It's starting to change, but it's a recent shift. So I think I'm hopeful that we will see more Indigenous presence and these traditions. I mean, something like Cafe Aloni opening, more and more kind of cultural events revolving around these traditions. It's just taken a long time to get to that place.
And so my follow-up question is, as Matt mentioned before we started the session tonight, myself and my husband came down to Zion today, and as we entered the park and we started driving through, I immediately said to him, I was like, wow, like I can immediately feel, I don't know if everyone who goes there feels that's like, I immediately feel that this is sacred land, and I'm very conscious that this land is not actually land that is owned by a national park or by the government, that this is land owned by Indigenous tribes. And it was kind of weird. We got out at one spot and we're looking at a site, and we saw a couple, a middle-aged couple who, to our mind, appeared Indigenous, and they were looking at the site too. And I got back in the car, I said to Charlie, I wonder what they think. Like, coming to the site, like in a sense of colonized land. And so my follow-up question is, how does documentary filmmaking and visual storytelling, because I feel like storytelling is one thing, but in this, like, we're not able to grasp things unless we know what it looks like, what it tastes like, feels like. How does visual storytelling function as a subtle form of activism in order to recreate an awareness for us, or rebuild the awareness of a fair, how could I put it, expression of land within this nation, and in a sense not in a sort of white activism sense, in the sense that, like, we're trying to reclaim and we're trying to overthrow the government and we're trying to install anarchy, because I never get the impression that that's what's going on in subtle activism in Indigenous cultures. But how does documentary filmmaking enforce that awareness of we're still here and we want to be a part of this nation, but we also want to be recognized as owners of and custodians, not owners, but rather custodians of this land?
Sure. And I will start out by saying too that documentary filmmaking as a practice has also changed a lot, just like museums, because for a long time, the participants didn't always have kind of the final say in their story that was being presented. And sometimes with some of the community members that we work with, there's a little bit of nervousness in the beginning, which I completely understand. When a whole crew comes and they have their big cameras and expensive equipment, and you show up and then you're expecting this tribal community to share their knowledge and share their traditions. So the whole process really has to be built on a foundation of trust to begin with, which I also think is a shift in practice. So even documentary filmmaking as a whole has changed a lot over time. So I think if the project is done as a true collaborative partnership, that's when it really can become some of that subtle activism. So I did want to acknowledge that off the bat too, because there is still this history of kind of the Edward Curtis documentation of Indigenous communities, which is a very different type of documentary filmmaking, like a project such as KCET's Tending Nature. So, so as part of that collaboration and making sure that the community members are the ones who sort of have the final say in the episode, they're comfortable sharing all of their knowledge and their information, I think that's where they're able to function in this subtle activism, because it's their choice of what knowledge they want to share with the outside world, but they're also recognizing the importance of having a platform for this knowledge for the first time, because it doesn't really exist in many other places. It doesn't exist in your standard textbooks that K through 12 curriculum is reading. It doesn't exist in a lot of other places where the public is actively receiving this information. So for the knowledge that can and should be shared, it's a new platform to give a voice for communities that haven't really been heard in the past.
Yeah, great. Thank you. I really appreciate that. I think as a lot of us on this forum tonight are graduate students, and we sometimes fail to recognize, or we just don't think about what, you know, younger generations are not receiving. We're often focused on what we're receiving and what we're not receiving. So yeah, I appreciate that. So yeah, Matt, I'd like at this point to open up questions to anyone else who'd like to ask questions to Paige.
Sure. And thank you, Paige and Chantal. Great questions, great presentation. Tiffany, do you have any questions, or Alexander, or Aya, Matt, Fran, Laura, anyone? Maybe to start off.
I have a question.
Oh, yeah, please.
Sorry.
No, please.
Since you talked about land acknowledgement, the topic has come up. I'm taking an anthropology class right now, and that topic has come up a couple of times, and people have different, very, very intense opinions about this. Do you find there's sort of like ways to handle it and ways not to handle it? And the reason I'm asking is because a lot of, sorry? A lot of people have adopted land acknowledgements, and then the criticism I often hear is that it falls flat, that it just becomes another sort of veneer, another way to integrate this into, for example, an academic institution for events, or for events in general, maybe with museums or other spaces, and that there's no skin in the game, if you will. And the counterexample that comes up is, you know, if you do, for example, an event at the MoMA, and the MoMA says, okay, we're going to do a land acknowledgement. The land acknowledgement may not be enough by itself, but what if there's some other thing attached to it? Something of like, oh, we're, you know, doing a collaboration, or we're offering other resources, offering a space or some sort of arts, like making a space for people to voice their own voices, or, you know, it could go on and could go on. But how do you feel about these acknowledgements, and then how does that extrapolate onto the larger picture?
Yes, that's a very good question. And I think what your example of something like the MoMA, for example, and being able to do more is always beneficial, because the land acknowledgement should be a starting point. It shouldn't just be, okay, we've posted something up on the wall, we're done. We've done everything that we need to do to engage with this community. So, you know, it's a tricky question, because there's not always one straightforward way to do it. It's going to depend on the area, on the ancestral communities that have inhabited that area. Sometimes it's more challenging than others. Even here in the San Francisco Bay Area, there are multiple Ohlone groups. I won't even get into the challenges of kind of federal recognition versus non-federally recognized tribes, but sometimes that can play a role as well. So I think as long as it's stemming from the community members, you know, we can all be really well-intentioned, and we can all think, okay, well, I have to get something up by my email signature, I have to get something up, a sign on the building, or we have to have an announcement made before our meeting. And that is well and good, but if that isn't made without talking to somebody from the community first, then the intention does sort of fall flat. So in my recommendation, just in both Los Angeles now and San Francisco, which are two areas, there are multiple Tongva groups down in Los Angeles, there's multiple Ohlone groups here in the Bay Area, is just talking to as many Native leaders as possible. At SF State, we work with the American Indian Studies Department. There is a talk for having a more formalized land acknowledgement placed on the campus. That hasn't happened yet, but I did work with one of our American Indian Studies faculty members to at least talk about one that would be appropriate for our museum space on the campus, for example. So I know that's probably not as much of an answer, but I think just making sure you're talking to as many people as possible, even if you are as well-intentioned, and using that as a starting place for the conversation. And hopefully doing more than just the acknowledgement, but ways to integrate more cultural programming and more involvement in the arts and more involvement in your spaces.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, Tiffany, please.
I just wanted to offer, I want to say thank you to everyone for hosting and bringing this into my awareness. And yeah, just throughout my time at CIS, I have the anthropology department. We hosted the AIM West conference. We hosted that group there. And that was, I was able to take a course with Tony Gonzalez, who's president of AIM West, and he hosts there's a radio show on KPFA that has to do with local Indigenous issues and things that are have been going on for years. So I was lucky to have that introduction, but also Segorite Land Trust is a local Bay Area Ohlone women-led organization that's getting donations to reclaim land. And that I think like some way for people to like organize around land reassignment, turning over lands back to local groups for restoration and guidance would be, I don't know how we can advocate. I think there's, like I said, groups already empowered, but I think our support of that awareness of how we could all, benefit from knowing more about the world we live in and the people who tend to it, and how we can do that too. I'm just really grateful to have these conversations in a moment like right now. So thank you all for sharing.
And I would recommend too, if you're not familiar with the Amamutsin Land Trust as well, which is based down in Pinnacles National Park. They're also another Ohlone group. Their ancestral territory is a little bit closer to Monterey Bay and Santa Cruz, but they are a land trust that works very closely with government agencies to reacquire their land and also restore it through traditional practice. So both that and the Segorite are two really great examples here in the Bay Area. It speaks to something that in the environmental studies field is called collaborative resource management, which I think is also a newer trend, even in the environmental studies field, which has typically been grounded in the Western science framework. And collaborative resource management is people, communities, whether that's tribes or other community members, working in tandem with land trusts, with government agencies, with multiple public stakeholders and landowners. So I think the more that we see of those types of partnerships, and just the more that we can educate governing institutions like the Forest Service or the Bureau of Land Management, the importance of partnering with tribes and Indigenous community members, the better. And I think more and more of these partnerships are happening now, which is really great.
Thank you. So I just first of all invite everybody, if you have a sort of recommended resource, you just throw it in the comments and we can put that up in the later on in the descriptions. Paige, one of my questions is, you mentioned this sort of decolonizing lens that we're sort of putting on our own institutions now. and it, you know, in some of those first shots, right, when you look at the Bay Area, it's completely transformed, right? It's just buildings on top of buildings and top of buildings. And so it really seems like, you know, to decolonize the sort of systems that are undergirding, you know, that degree of dense urbanization is so, you know, above and beyond what we can even imagine. So one, I'm curious kind of how you see maybe scaling up that decolonization on the one hand, and some strategies that maybe you've had in your own experience. And then second, I'm really interested, you mentioned the sort of indigenous work against solar development in the deserts. And I'd be really kind of curious how that, you know, very tricky issue of energy and you know, even renewable energy versus fossil fuel was navigated as you can see.
Sure. So I'll start with the decolonizing question, and then I may need you to remind me of the second, but I'll try to keep the solar one in too. So in terms of kind of broad decolonizing strategies, it's really difficult, especially as you said, with, you know, such a concretized, urbanized environment. But to me, it's really about giving voice to communities that just haven't had a voice in the past. So my work is from the museum standpoint, which is a little bit different from other spaces. But in the museum world, it's something that's really rapidly changed since about the late 80s, early 90s. Probably imagine most people in this group are familiar with NAGPRA, or the passage of the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. That law was passed in 1990, and that was really kind of the turning point, specifically for museums, in terms of thinking about their relationships with Native communities, and whose voices got to be heard in the care of this type of material. So it's really only been about 30 years that museums have really started to have these conversations. And I would say it's only been maybe in the past 5 that it's really started to ramp up. A lot of museums are just starting to rethink their entire structure for how they care for Indigenous material, whether that includes incorporating Indigenous curation, without getting into too many of the museum details, because I know this isn't completely museum focused, but thinking, for example, of, you know, if your museum has a large care of California Indian baskets, the tribes don't view them as artifacts. They view them as living beings sometimes, or friends, or, you know, at the very least, cultural treasures. And so even just subtle shifts in terminology, they're not artifacts, they're not specimens. They've always been stored in a very hermetically sealed environment, which is what we need for long-term preservation of material culture objects. But sometimes these baskets benefit from having sage or cornmeal or something left with them. And museum conservators, you know, completely cringe at this thought. They think, how could you ever, you know, leave something like food material in a museum collections facility? But if it makes better relations with that community, and if that's better for the ongoing cultural care of that object, then museums have to start to let some of these things go. And so it's really just about giving a voice and authority to the community who's always had their culture collected and interpreted for them. So that's kind of my specific example from the museum field, which is a little bit harder to broaden out, but I think it's just more of listen to communities that haven't been able to be listened to in the past. And maybe that can help shape some of these conversations, whether it's a museum or whether it's urban development. You know, one of the trickiest projects going on right now in Berkeley is the Shell Mounds and the West Berkeley Shell Mound site, which I think a lot of people don't necessarily understand as a sacred site. One of the examples that I've been using lately is, I mean, look at what happened when Notre Dame caught on fire last year. So tragic, but millions of dollars poured in and millions of people came to aid. But that's because that's a really well-known sacred place in a very Western established religion. But what about sacred places for other communities that don't have that acknowledgement? So I think that's where some of the decolonizing thinking can come into play. I don't know what the solutions are for kind of the broader, you know, total urban expansion, but in terms of my individual work in the museum field, it's about working with communities to learn about culturally preferred methods of care, interpretation, exhibition of their items. Should this object even go on display? Should it go back to the community? And facilitating more of those collaborative partnerships. So for your second question, the solar, this is a big one. It's also another issue that has kind of resurfaced recently too. I don't know if anyone read up in the news just a few months ago with the Wiyot tribe, also up in Northern California, not too far from the Tolowa Dine, being able to stop a wind farm from going in on their sacred land. So that was another similar example. It's not that the tribes are against alternative energy, it's just the fact of where they were going to be built. And in both instances with some of the large scale solar plants out in the southeastern deserts of California, as well as this wind farm up in Wiyot territory, they were going to be built on sacred land, which included burial grounds. So in that case, it's not that the tribes don't want these things to happen and don't want, and they're advocating for fossil fuels. It's definitely not that. It's just the fact that they're not often consulted in the placement of even something that might be better for the environment. But if it's going to be on top of a burial ground, it's just treated differently than if it was going to be placed on top of, what's the big cemetery in Washington, D.C.? Can't even remember the name right now. But just as an example, like you would never drop a solar
Arlington.
Like that. Arlington, yes. You would never just drop a cemetery or a wind farm on top of Arlington Cemetery without kind of giving it a second thought. So I think it's more about just having these collaborative conversations with all stakeholders involved, while we all collaboratively think about the best solutions for our environment.
I love that example that you just used, Paige, because I think that sometimes we need really real examples to help us compare how we would view these things in our own culture, if they were happening to us compared to other people's cultures. And what I wanted to just mention, following what you've just really beautifully laid out for us, is I think this is part of what we wanted to encourage the sharing of in this panel of some of the participants that weren't here, and that it's two-part. And one of those things is, for example, Toby McLeod, that runs the Sacred Lands Project, is part of Toby's work is that he's brought attention to many different groupings of Indigenous tribes and Indigenous peoples across the planet that have a similar objective, but from unique individual perspectives of their cultural viewpoint and of their geographical specificity, which I feel is really important to recognize, particularly when you were talking about the whole essence of recognizing, for example, land rights. I think that in our sort of Western culture, when we think about the idea of land rights, even when we use that term, land rights or land recognition, it's a very legal designation, and it's not personal. It's not personal to a particular geography, to a particular type of land, to a particular status of land. It's more particular to property ownership. Whereas in Indigenous culture, it's really less about ownership and more about a particular way of being with a specific geography, which is something that is really hard for us to conceive in a modernized world where a lot of our geography is homogenized by buildings and parks and roads and all sorts of facilities that we propagate. And so I think that that type of work is really important, not only to raise awareness through subtle activism to Indigenous land rights in general, but to the specificity of how land rights play out in particular communities in different parts of the world. And I think that's that's really something important that we need to pay attention to. And then the second, aspect of that, which unfortunately, Melinda and Chihiro couldn't join us this evening, is in how we deal with land issues post-modernization. And so one of the things that Chihiro and Melinda's project deals with is, their project deals with the prayer walks that were taking place around the Richmond refineries in the last decades. And so how do we deal with a post-industrialized environment from an Indigenous point of view? So often when we're looking at Indigenous culture and we're looking at Indigenous connections to land, we're looking at a primary connection to land when there is still a connection to land, and we don't pay a lot of respect to how does an Indigenous approach deal with a broken connection to land. So in other words, post-colonization, once the land has been colonized, once the land has been defiled, once the land is being poisoned with industrial, sort of facilities or consumption, how does an Indigenous culture go about not necessarily reclaiming the land, but reconnecting to that land, bringing healing back to that land, and bringing community connection back to that land? And so I don't know, Paige, if you can perhaps, if you have any experience with that in your connection to Indigenous cultures, in the sense that I think we don't want to be idealistic, in the sense that like land is not what it used to be. Land has been defiled, land has been commercialized, land has been developed. And like you said, like we don't necessarily recognize the shell mounds, because a lot of the shell mounds are parking lots and shopping malls and all these various spaces. So once they have been transformed into these modernized spaces, how do we treat them then, and how do we reconnect to the healing of those lands in this post-industrial situation?
Well, and I only speak from what I have learned from collaborating with community members. And of course, it's always going to be up to the individual. I think sometimes we fall into a little bit of the trap of, all Native California people have these deep ties to the land, for example. So I think having the individual conversations with people to get their perspective is always helpful. But with a lot of the community members that I did work with, even in really urban spaces, one of the ways to find connections to that land is just being able to maintain and practice cultural traditions, because with a lot of these cultural traditions that generated from thousands of years of living in one's environment, nature and culture aren't separate. And so even being able to just speak one's language, for example, is still a tie to nature. To be able to practice basket weaving or a traditional song or a traditional dance, and a lot of them have been lost, but quite a few of them are coming back. And so I think especially in the more urban areas, that's a great way to maintain that connection. Here in the Bay Area, for example, there is a weaver named Linda Yamani. She lives in Monterey, but she's one of the Ohlone bands as well. She's Rums in Ohlone, and she wove the first Ohlone basket in over 200 years, only about 5 or 6 years ago. She went and visited museum collections. She looked at archives. She reconstructed the technique completely on her own because no basket weavers survived post-contact. So Linda being able to bring this basket back to her community and be able to teach the language again. She now leads basket weaving workshops and demonstrations. That's one example of someone that was able to bring back this tie to nature, even if maybe she comes from one of the more urbanized areas now. I mean, Monterey is not nearly as urban as San Francisco, but just coming from the Ohlone bands, for example, that were one of the ones that were really hit hardest by contact. So I think reviving language, reviving tradition, that's also very tied to healing. Being able to have cultural programs in communities helps with alcoholism, helps with some of the other social issues amongst communities. And so I think that's a great tie to nature, even if it means that you're doing it in kind of a more concretized area.
Great, thank you so much for that, Paige. Fran Osborne, I know you just shared something, and I'm just going to allow us to diverge for a second here to include a broader Indigenous perspective. And I think what you shared is relevant, and I don't know if you'd just like to share with the rest of the audience what you shared on the chat. Oh, she just said she
Chantal, if you want to read that, you're
yeah, he just said he had to go. So thanks for the, I always look to what artists are doing, and I'm not sure if this is relevant, but I was in Santa Fe, I came across the work of Emily Johnson, who is from Alaska. Her work deals with traditional ceremonies and the land and healing in many ways. I think artists are a great bridge for all these issues. I think what I want to respond just to this comment is, I know, even though I don't come across it I know that there is so much going on, so much going on. And at the same time that I know that there is so much going on, I just don't hear about it. I don't see it. I don't have access to it unless you are specifically engaged in this particular field. And this is, in a sense, what is really important to me about documentary filmmaking, whether it be about this issue or the issue that I'm dealing with in my own personal research or other Indigenous issues, is that I just feel that in this day and age, we need visual mediums or visual forms and mediums to really bring the work of smaller communities to greater populations. And I feel it's important because I feel that when this is done, it inspires people who've never thought of engaging in these activities or in these groups of work or with these populations. It inspires them to do so, and not actually in a, you know, sort of, how could I put it, in a fake way. It's that it genuinely touches people. And so I'm wondering, and I don't know, you know, if others can speak to this as well, it's just a lot of us are working in the field of history, in the field of museum studies, in the field of philosophy. And I'm wondering how these various fields, philosophy, history, academia, can use visual storytelling and can use documentary as a very visual, powerful form of storytelling to reach a much broader audience, to help a much more disengaged version of our, or area of our population to engage in places that they didn't know that they wanted to engage in until the point that they saw this type of work. And I suppose I'm opening this up to anyone to sort of answer or address.
Well, Chantal, I'll just quickly comment, especially in terms of academia. I think one thing about documentary film is that it appeals to broader learning styles. You know, not everyone learns as well by reading information in a textbook and trying to retain it. And so visual storytelling in terms of appealing to visual learners. But it's also just much more publicly accessible, because the only people who are reading, you know, very specific history or anthropology or even philosophy texts are usually ones who are graduate students in that discipline. But documentary film on sort of public platforms, such as, you know, KCET is a PBS affiliate, so it plays on TV. I think that's just an easier way to reach people, rather than people that have really self-selected and chosen these really specific disciplines, because it's easier to watch a program and retain content that way than commit the time to, you know, reading a lengthy book or an article, for example. As much as all of us in this room are very much engaged in that work, I'm sure kind of your average person might not necessarily be. So that's where I think the power of documentary film is an informal educational resource, because it's it's different than the type of learning you do in academia, certainly.
Yeah, thank you, Paige, for that. Is there anyone who would like to respond from a philosophical point of view?
Well, one of the questions that I had was, and you mentioned, Chantal, in terms of sort of superficial or a token kind of, or tacit sort of surface level engagement with this. You know, I think there's a lot of willingness or desire to engage in this, you know, collaborative resource management, and wanting to sort of bring in these voices and wanting to decolonize, et cetera. And I guess one question I have was, how do you do that in or how do you maintain a sort of respectful approach in a way that doesn't you know, continue those sort of patterns that we might be more familiar with in terms of an extractive, instrumental relationship with this knowledge that is so profound and critical and land-based. You know, when it's knowledge, you know, we so desperately need, I think, to you know, institutionalize, and yet the way we go about institutionalizing it could very well reproduce some of those difficult relationships that have gotten us into this mess to begin with.
Yeah, it's also a tough question. I think that it starts with who is restructuring curriculum and that type of knowledge, and whose voice is included in that dialogue. So I work with a professor of environmental studies at SF State that is actually part of a broader kind of nationwide group that's restructuring environmental studies curriculum to sort of finally formally include TEK. But all of the kind of participants that are working with are people who work with this kind of form of collaborative resource management and work with community members. So I think, you know, it's going to take people at kind of higher levels regardless to make any sort of change into sort of formally integrating this type of thinking, but it has to still be in partnership with the knowledge that can be shared, because some of this knowledge isn't really supposed to leave the community. And so sort of having those conversations in terms of, you know, what can be shared publicly and how can we make this a way to formalize this knowledge, to at least put it on par with other ways of thinking about the environment and other lenses of inquiry. I think it's just the best way to do it, and just the more partnerships, the better.
Yeah, I just, I want to add a slightly different perspective to what Paige is sharing, and I'm very consciously aware of the fact that we're talking about, you know, sort of North American perspective here, and that's what we're focusing on for this evening. But how different it can be in different parts of the world. And I know, you know, I speak a lot to my sister about the Australian perspective and the Aboriginal perspective within Australia. And one of the things that I deal with in my own sort of research is that I live in a country that is supposedly, quote unquote, you know, decolonized post-apartheid through bringing the Bantu perspective, so the Bantu speaking tribes perspective in South Africa, into prominence. But, you know, it took me sort of 35 years of my life to realize that, oh, before there were people before the Bantu speaking people, you know, who were the San Bushmen, and they have no perspective, like basically within a South African context. And even it's in a sense even more in a post-apartheid world. They have even less perspective than they did in the apartheid world, in their given environment. And I think in that aspect, in their case, they're just so desperate to get their knowledge and their information out that they are often they're very aware of cultural misappropriation, and they're very aware of how they have been culturally misappropriated in various times and periods, but they're in a sense less concerned about that now, because they're more concerned about whoever will want to collaborate with us in order to spread our cause is welcome to. And I think that's also interesting in the sense that, like, I think times are changing in the sense that the line between the privileged and the less privileged is changing, in the sense that the privileged are still the privileged and the less privileged are still the less privileged, but the urgency for how they collaborate has changed. And the urgency sometimes for getting the message out has changed in how certain Indigenous cultures around the world see how they collaborate with us, in a sense. And I find that interesting in the sense that, like, sometimes I've wanted, you know, to sort of be super appropriate, and found that that has been inappropriate, in the sense that you need to sort of hear what is it that community or that culture or those elders are asking of you in that moment and in that time. Like, what type of partnership are they expecting of you? Like, and I wouldn't even say partnership, what type of friendship are they expecting of you in that particular moment in time? Because it changes based on the particular political situations of our countries and our states and our borders, and, you know, all the environments that they have to deal with that seemingly don't affect us on a day-to-day basis.
Chantal, was that a question for Paige, or was that for everybody?
Well, I think it was more like a statement and a question. I think it was just, I was more sort of trying to throw a different perspective, you know, into the mix, in terms of dealing with various Indigenous relations are not the same in all parts of the world, in all types of environments. And I think, you know, I've really appreciated what Paige has brought to the table in her explanation of this particular project, which is very California based. But part of what we were hoping to bring across in the panel is the complexity and the diversity across different geographic regions in the world. And so I think that, you know, historically, these dynamics that Paige has sort of really pointed to are not contingent on Indigenous cultures in general. They're contingent on a particular culture and the particular colonial culture they're coming into contact with, and the particular geographic region they're coming into contact with. And I think that soup, that mix, is something that one always needs to pay attention to when one is entering these issues. And I say this, you know, coming, for example, into California myself as a South African. So when I first came into my PhD, I thought, oh, well, maybe I can study these issues in North America. And I very soon discovered that I feel very inadequate to do that. First, because I'm not a white North American. So I don't even represent the colonizer within America. I don't represent the Indigenous nation or person within America, and I don't represent the geography within America. And I think, but I represent something else, and another geography, and another space, and another place. And so I think it's just important when we look at these matters and we look at these issues to think about them very geographically and very cultural geographically.
Thanks, Chantal. I was going to ask Sean if he had any thoughts on Indigenous and subtle activism, but I'm not sure. I think he has to leave right now. And I know Laura also has some experience in working with Sami people in Iceland. I don't know if she's available to speak to her experience. But I do want to thank you, Chantal, for that, and Paige as well. This has been really, I mean, another great PCC forum for sure. But are there any other questions or comments? Laura, please.
I was listening to this. It's been so lovely, and I really was appreciating everything that Paige was saying in terms of just like the living nature of some of these, what we call artifacts. That was definitely a bit of info that I learned really, really early on. And I think being able to bring them to life, as it were, whether it be through a museum exhibit, which is awesome. And I've learned so much through the museums that I visited in Scandinavia. It's not Iceland, by the way, it's Scandinavia. And but also like the documentary and seeing humans, right, like individual people who are still living is absolutely important. And I think what Chantal was just kind of leaning towards in terms of these various layers that Indigenous communities have. I mean, you've got all of those layers within their own social structure, within, especially in contemporary times, where any semblance of what we could maybe pretend was once homogeneity is definitely gone among contemporary Indigenous communities, because a lot of them are now, you know, just sort of people like us, right? And so they have differing views, and there's not that kind of centralized, they all believe the same thing, or they all, you know, meet together around a fire. And I mean, these are all idealizations of what are essentially people like us. Or at least that's what I've learned with the particular community I've studied. But I think what's more interesting about this is that within that there's these layers of humanity, but then also how it relates to, like Chantal was saying, the colonizers. And the Sami people in Scandinavia had such a different experience of their colonization than definitely people in North America who were slaughtered outright. And in some other parts of Africa where there was ongoing sort of struggles in terms of power, money, slavery, etc. And so I do think that each Indigenous community, and then how you therefore engage with it as a researcher, has such a unique history and so many different sort of experiences that happened to them. And on top of all of that, as Chantal was saying, you have the climate, which is like a huge issue, especially looking at the difference between engaging with the Sami people in the Arctic, right, compared to like the Bushmen in South Africa. I mean, it's just an entirely different arrangement. They have completely different life focuses and needs and material objects that are available to them. And I think it was Paige at the very beginning, maybe not the very beginning, I came in a little bit late, but you said something to the effect of you can't separate their culture from nature. And I think that that's really true. And that's definitely been my experience of it. So there's a way in which all engagement has to take all of those factors into account, which in some ways is really daunting and can be really overwhelming. But also I think it really does bring it back to the kind of one-on-one connections and the friendships, and in some cases partnerships that can be sort of created by both outsiders and insiders within communities. They make, you know, relationships to each other. The interesting thing about the Sami people is they were colonized across 4 different countries. And so there are Sami people who live in Finland who cannot speak to or have never had any experience with Sami people from Norway. And so even they are building bridges amongst each other from very different sort of colonized cultures, but having this sort of shared history. And so I think if you really kind of go back to the small, which is kind of like an Indigenous idea, right? What's in front of you, what's local, what's available. So if you can go back to the individual relationships, that's your best bet in terms of proceeding with all of this. And And yeah, and it also is just like way more fun to like actually make connections to individuals and to sort of be able to share in their visions rather than to kind of have a, you know, a bird's eye view where you're not actually connecting or getting deep with anybody. So I don't really have any questions. This has been wonderful. And it's a shame that the other people weren't there, but it's also filled out the time perfectly fine. So sometimes less is more, but thank you. It's wonderful to hear that. I definitely have dreamed about documentary filmmaking since the moment my project came to me. And so this is just another little message reminding me that that's on the horizon one day. So thanks, you guys.
Thank you so much.
Also typing my email into the chat field if anyone wants to stay in touch, especially because, you know, we're all here in the Bay Area. Please don't hesitate to reach out.
Thank you. And Paige, I know one of the things that I heard and what I sort of chose not to do is, and you know, one of the things you're talking about land acknowledgement and tribal recognition, and I just really realized that I don't speak the language. I don't really know even the history that that characterizes the land that I live on now. And so I, you know, am in no position to do a land acknowledgement, I think, but I don't know if you have any experience with that, or if there's, if you'd like to tell us about the land that we're on, just in terms of Ohlone history at all, or anything that you'd like to share with us about that before we leave here.
Sure. So just, you know, I'll provide a little brief overview just from my knowledge, which, you know, has been gleaned from working with community members, because if you asked an Ohlone person, they might have a really just different statement. But for anyone that's just maybe not from the area or not as familiar, so the Ohlone is kind of the bigger name for many groups here in San Francisco. They're not a federally recognized tribe. There are multiple bands that are not federally recognized. And there's a lot of reasons for that. That's the case for different tribal communities across the state, but also across North America. So there are multiple Ohlone groups, and their ancestral territory stretches from San Francisco all the way down to kind of Monterey Bay and Santa Cruz area. And California, just as a whole, was contacted a lot later than some of the other tribes in the rest of the country. And so if you think about what was going on in California in, say, the kind of late 1700s, early 1800s, pre-gold rush area, when San Francisco barely existed as a city, compared to, say, what was happening on the East Coast and New York City, and, you know, Broadway's lights were already on. It just kind of helps put it in perspective a little bit to think about how late the West Coast was contacted and colonized. But because of that, when that did happen, when the missions started to spring up, there's a few missions that encompass Ohlone territory, including Mission Dolores here in San Francisco, as well as Mission San Jose and Carmel. It really devastated the community. I can't say that the Ohlone were the tribe hit the hardest, but they were definitely one of the tribes hit hardest, just with introduced diseases and violence and devastating population losses. So the number of people who lived in California declined so drastically in such a short amount of time. That's something that we really don't talk about in kind of K through 12 curriculum. People have really shied away from the word genocide, but I think we need to use it. And that really was the case here in the Bay Area. So much to the fact that even something like the Ohlone basket weaver that I mentioned, there's only about a dozen Ohlone baskets in museum collections worldwide, even in the British Museum and a few other places. Thank you, Tiffany, for also including the comment of genocide and enslavement. That's what the mission system was. Nobody talks about it that way. And so while, you know, Ohlone people did survive, they are still here. I mean, you know, all the videos we just watched and all the community members we've been working with are living proof of that. It's also just a history that's not really talked about here in San Francisco. So yeah, that's kind of a brief overview from kind of more of a historian's perspective, but also why it's just so important that people like Linda, who's weaving these baskets after 200 years, that Vincent and Lewis, who are bringing back Ohlone foods that haven't been eaten in their community for hundreds of years, is just really important that these projects have only been happening in the last decade or even just like the last 5 years.
Thank you. And it's so interesting kind of, you know, seeing, I mean, you're in the museum, I want to call it an industry, but the same sort of sector that, you know, when the you know, the whole kind of hullabaloo surrounding Ishi, the last Yahi, it's kind of interesting to see how that, how the relationships have changed, how the sort of approach to representing Indigenous voices have changed. Yeah, so I'm curious if you have any thoughts on that, or we can just leave it at that too.
Sure. Well, yeah, I think Ishi is a really good example. If anyone has had the chance to read Ishi's Brain by Oren Starr, it's a really excellent book, and it shows the entire, you know, kind of century-long journey of Ishi being able to be finally kind of reunited and cremated in the traditional way of his ancestors. But that's kind of the very well-known sort of case study example of what's wrong with museums, at least in the past. I think a lot of us have made a lot of really positive changes, but a big part of my work and what I teach my graduate students is that we need to be reflective. We need to be critical about the history of our discipline in order to shape it for the future. And I think that's the same of all disciplines, whether it's environmental studies or philosophy or anthropology. And so Ishi is kind of a good case study representative of how we just want to think about a little bit differently about past practice and what we can do now moving forward.
Thanks, Paige. Before we close up, I'm just curious if Paige or Chantal or Tiffany or Laura or Aya or Shanna, I still can't pronounce this, Shanran, if anybody would like to share any last thoughts, leave us with any last ideas or.
Yeah, Matt, I'd really just like to follow up on what Paige was saying.
Please,
here,
yeah.
In the sense that I think that the transformation of our disciplines is really key. You know, we've been talking about, for example, documentary filmmaking as if it's a pure discipline in the sense, but I think it's very closely related to the way that museums used to function in forming negative perceptions of culture on Indigenous societies. And, you know, documentary filmmaking back in the day with a lot of European filmmakers and tools was used to sort of enforce the idea of natives and native activity and native actions. And so I think that what like Paige is sort of trying to bring across is really important, really true in the sense that it's not the tools that are at fault, and it's that we that are the new drivers of the tools need to really push forward in forming new worlds, in using these tools of documentary filmmaking and museums and educational facilities as ways to really enlighten people. And it's our responsibility and it's our job to bring this forward, no one else's. And it's upon us to form the relationships with the communities and with the people that we want to highlight. It's, you know, it's not that these are just people we want or need to talk about. It's that these are people that we need to build relationships with in order to highlight their stories. And so I think that's something really important that we need to realize. And I'm very encouraged by what Paige has shared in terms of the museum experience. And I really look forward to the way that these tools can help educate the next generations. And so, yeah.
Thank you, Chantal. Any last thoughts from anybody else?
Just thank you all. It's been enlightening.
Thanks,
Good to
Tiffany.
hear.
thank you for having me. And yeah, please stay in touch. These are all really great things to be discussing and sharing amongst peers. So
yeah, and thank you so much for sharing your email. I'm sure there will be some follow-ups, definitely.
please.
Well, anyway, thank you all for coming out tonight and being with us as we sort of dive into some of these issues. I'm going to stop the recording, but feel free to ask any informal questions or just kind of chat as we hang out tonight. Thanks.